Yeah, so today we're going to do a review of Daf Yud Gimel, but we're starting from the Mishnah on Daf Yud Beis Amud Beis Kayoytze Boy. The Mishnah has basically three dinim. It's really talking about dinim which apply to the Ritzech once he goes to the Ir Miklot. So the first din is if the people want to be mechabadim in the Ir Miklot, he has to tell them that I'm a Ritzech, don't be mechabed me. If they say, I still want to be mechabed, we still want to be mechabed you, that's okay. We learn out of the pasuk Zed Ritzech that he has to say something, but once he says something, he can be respect, they can be mechabedim. That's the first. And the second din in the Mishnah is actually machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and Meir, whether you pay rent, whether the Ritzech b'shoigig pays rent to the Leviim who live in the city. So Rabbi Yehuda says yes, they pay rent, and Meir says no. Gemara is going to explain the reasoning. And the final machlokes is whether when he goes out of Golos, he goes back to a position of respect. For example, if he was a Nasi or a Bezdin, does he go back? When he goes back to his city, but Mises Kohen Gadol, and Kohen Gadol dies, does he go back to his position of power or authority or position of leadership or not? So the Gemara discusses the case of Malim Hayisachar Levim first of all. The Gemara doesn't discuss the first din of Ritzeh be Mechabed, but the Gemara straight away goes to discuss the second din of the Machlokes Rabbi Yehuda Meir of Malim Hayisachar Levim. And there's the Machlokes Amiroim, which cities we're talking about. Rav Kahana says that the whole Machlokes Rabbi Yehuda Meir is only talking about the 6 primary Ori Miklat cities. They're arguing whether when the pasuk says Lachem, the pasuk says that Ir Miklat is going to be for the Ritzeh, is it for him to use for whatever, and he doesn't have to pay rent, or is it just Liklita? Is it just for him to be protected, but he does have to pay rent? That's how Rav Kahana explains the Machlokes. But were it to be the other 42 cities, which are not primary Ir Miklat, they serve as Ir Miklat, but they're not really Ir Miklat. The 42 cities of the Levim, everyone agrees that then you have to pay rent to the Levim. That is Rav Kahana's shit. The Rava argues, and he says no. The Machlokes is the halach is like Rava, that no, for sure when the pasuk says V'hayu Lachem La'Ari Miklat, Lachem means they're yours. You can do, and you don't have to pay rent to the Levim for the six cities of the Ari Miklat. The only time that you do have to pay rent, or there's a machlokes whether you have to pay rent or not, is going to get to the other 42 cities. Then there's a machlokes. One says that based on the pasuk about Leim Titnu, whether it's exactly similar to the 6 Ari Miklat, there you don't have to pay rent. Here also you don't have to. Or we say no, it's only similar in the sense that it's koila, that it protects the Ritzeh. But everyone agrees that's the machlokes with regards to 42 cities, but with regards to the 6 primary cities of the Ari Miklat, everyone agrees you don't pay rent. So that's machlokes Amiroim, Khan and Rava, where the machlokes is only going to get to the 6 cities, and the 42 cities everyone agrees you do pay rent, or the other way around. The machlokes is going to get to the 42 cities, and everyone agrees that by 6 you don't pay rent. That's Takat Halacha, like Rava. The 6 cities you don't pay rent, and Machlokes is only going to get to the 42. And even then, the halacha is halacha like Yehuda that you do pay rent. So halacha ends up being that you pay rent for the 42, but not for the 6. Now the Gemara discusses whether after the Ritzeh b'shoigeg finishes off, goes back to his city because the Kohen Gadol dies, does he go back to his position of authority, of leadership? So it's Taka learned out of a pasuk. We get to Avadivri actually, where the pasuk says that he goes back to his family. So Rabbi Yehuda learns that we learn from that pasuk that he goes back to his family, but he doesn't go back to the position that his family bequeathed him, that the family made him inherit. Rabbi says no, he also goes back to his position, because it says in the pasuk so we learn from Nekavoiso. And that's been a get to Avadivri after, this price is to him in Avadivri after 6 years. And we say the same applies to Golos. It says the word Yoshuv, we learn from there. So therefore that includes a Ritzeh. And it's Taka Braisa, which says clearly that the Yoshuv Ritzeh was also there's a Taka Machlokes from Yehuda Meir, whether the Taka goes back to the position of power that he had, the authority that he had till now. And we learn Gzeir Shava, Shiva. In other words, the pasuk says Yoshuv by Ritzech, and it said the extra word Yoshuv by Avadivri to tell me that whatever applies to Avadivri applies here as well. And just like there's a machlokes when you get to Avadivri, whether he goes back to Lishra, goes back to his position of authority or power of leadership, so too there's a machlokes when you get to Ritzech b'shoigeg as well. That is the end of Perek Elei Nagoylin, and now we move on to Perek Elei Naloikin, which is what we learned today in the Shiur. I'm not going to go through all the different cases in the Mishnah, but basically the Mishnah says a whole list of cases where you get Makkos. lists a whole bunch, all the chayve creases that if you get, even though the Torah doesn't say Malchus, like the Torah says punishment for chayve creases is karis. Nevertheless, you get Malchus according to the Tan of the mission. There's many other cases in this mission as well. Rashi and Tosfos both explain that each case, it's not an exhaustive list. This mission doesn't tell me the list of every single case where you get every avera that a person can do to get Malchus. Only those which have a chiddush. Itaka says all the chayve creases because of the chiddush. Chayve creases get Malchus. Not everyone agrees that chayve creases get Malchus. Some people say only regular chayve lav, and some say even chayve misas beznas. We'll soon see in the brisa. But the Mishnah, as Rashi and Tosfos both explain, are telling me cases which are chidushim, so chayve creases, plus other cases which there's various chidushim, as Rashi and Tosfos both explain. You can look inside there. So that's the Mishnah, a whole list of cases which get Malchus. The brisa is now brought because our Mishnah says something interesting. It draws the line by saying that chayve creases do get Malchus, chayve misas bezdin don't. So who's this going like? Who's the Tana of a Mishnah? So the Gemara says that the Mishnah, the Tana of the Mishnah must be going. It must be Rabbi Kiva talking. Why? Because there's a brayta which is a three-way machlokes tanoim. Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Kiva, and Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Shmuel says that not only chayve krisos get malchus, but even chayve misas bezdin. So our Mishnah can't go like Rabbi Shmuel, because Rabbi Shmuel say even chayve misas bezdin get malchus, and there's no chayve misas bezdin listed in our Mishnah. Rabbi Kiva says that chayve krisos do get malchus, which is in line with what our Mishnah says. Kivatak says the reason why chayve krisos get malchus is because they're not necessarily going to get kares because they could do tshuva, so therefore they get malchus because they're not necessarily going to get kares. Rabbi Yitzchak says that Rabbi Yitzchak, and the Brisa says his reasoning actually, that Rabbi Yitzchak says that even chayve krisos don't get even chayve krisos don't get malchus. Why do chayve krisos not get malchus? So it's a limit from achoisai. So the Torah says kares by all aroyas. And nevertheless, it feels the need to say achoisei again, even though achoisei was included in arayos. So we learn that the fact that the Torah says by achoisei that you get kares to teach you that only that the only punishment a baal achoisei gets is kares, but not malchus. And from there we learn to all other cases of krisis as well, with the klal of anything which was in the klal. We learn from there that every single case of krisis doesn't get malchus. So here we have a brayso basically with three different cases, three different shittas. Tanoim, Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Kiva, Rabbi Yitzchak. Rabbi Shmuel says every lav in the Torah, with a few exceptions we'll soon see, but basically even chayve misas bezdin get malchus. Rabbi Kiva says that only chayve krisis gets malchus, and Rabbi Yitzchak says no, even chayve krisis don't get malchus, only regular chayve lav get malchus. So now the Gemara is going to explain the reasoning for each shitta. It starts off with the reason with the shitta of Rabbi Shmuel. And what's the reasoning of Rabbi Shmuel? Rabbi Shmuel says that every chayve misas bezdin even gets malchus. So the Gemara Taka says, where is it learned out from? It's learned out of the pasuk which says, "Im lo yisish melas," is called divrei Torah. If you don't keep the Torah, then you're going to get touch. You're going to get makkos. Hifla Hashem is makkoischa. So we don't really know that means malchus. It just means you're going to get punished. So how do you know that it refers to malchus? It says over there hifla. It says a similar word, the pilu hashayfa v'ikar in the parashas of malchus. So just like over there, it's telling you that it's malchus. So too, over here you get malchus as well. So ultimately, the pasuk says in loisim las, you don't keep the Torah, you get malchus. The Gemara straight away asks, what do you mean? If that's the case, every single time you go against the Torah, even if you don't do an asay, you should also get malchus. You don't see krishma in the morning. You don't eat matzah and pesach. You should get malchus. And we know that not to be the case. No one holds you get malchus to chayve asay. So why not? So the Gemara Taka says because it says lashon loisishmar, and we know the Ravin says that when it says the lashon shamar or any other type of similar lashon pen and al, it's a loisasas. So we know that it's only referring to loisasas. Okay, it's only referring to loisasas, but why? There's other lois. Not every loisasa gets malchus. We know that lav shein by ma'isa doesn't get malchus. The Gemara says because it says the word lasais. So loisishmar lasais, we're only talking about cases where you're actively going against the Torah. But if you just lav shein by ma'isa, the way you transgressing the lav is by being passive, so then you don't get malchus. What about lav shenitik laseh? We know you don't get malchus for lav shenitik laseh, a lav where the Torah says don't do this, but if you do, you need to do kach v'kach. Right? Don't steal, but if you do, return the gezel, return the stolen object. You don't get malchus for that. Why not? It says in lo yisish melaseh, which seems to imply any lav in the Torah should be included. So the Gemara answers, excuse me. The Gemara answers that because by the parashas Malchus but it talks about the Einish Malkus straight away after it says Lo Sachsim Shoy B'Dishoy, you shouldn't muzzle an ox while it's threshing. So only those lamb which are similar to Lo Sachsim. And the Gemara Taka concludes that now we have this teretz, we don't need to give the teretzim given earlier. Even Chayve Asay and Chayve Lav Shein B'Maisa, Lav and Shein B'Maisa, the reason why you don't get Malkus can be simply because it's not comparable to Lo Sachsim Shoy B'Dishoy. So ultimately, just to conclude, the reason of Rabbi Shmuel is because it says in the Pasuk Lo Yishmei Lasais, you don't keep the Torah, you get Malkus. And we learn from any lab which is similar to Lo Sachsim Shoy B'Dishoy, which is a lab sheyesh b'mais, and it's not mitik lasei. So then you get malchus for that lab, and even chayve misas bez, and that's the shit of Rabbi Shmuel. By the way, at this stage, it's clear that Rabbi Shmuel Taka holds that if you get malchus for both, you get misa and malchus. For chayve misas bez, you get both punishments. You can't get both punishments as long as you were warned for both. But you can get both. Potentially, you can get both misa and malchus. Rabbi Kiva argues, says no, you don't get misa and malchus. Why not? Because of the principle of kedei rishasa. Kedei rishasa tells me, we learned this in Daf days, that you only get one punishment for one act. You can't even an act which is kind of two punishments. You don't get two punishments for one wicked act, and therefore you don't get misa and malchus. And that's why he says you don't get both. Rabbi Shmuel, what's Rabbi Shmuel going to answer back? He says, no, it's only talking about two totally different types of punishments, where it's a monetary punishment plus a capital punishment, but where you're having a misa plus a malchus. Malchus is really just is like halfway towards misa. It's the same type of punishment. Misa richter, the Gemara calls it, and therefore you do get the two punishments. Now the Gemara is going to ask, just a second. You're telling me that Rabbi Kiva says you don't get misa and malchus, Rabbi Kiva, the second shitter, because Kedei Rishasa say, why do you get kares and malchus? That's also two punishments. You're going to tell me because you could get out of it because you could do tshuva and you won't get the kares, but what happens if you haven't done tshuva? Then you shouldn't get malchus. Why do you get malchus in a situation where you haven't yet done tshuva? And maybe you'll never do tshuva. So the Gemara answers that Gemara suggests that we learn it from Gzeir Shava le'einem le'necha. Because by chayve misas bezdin, it said since by chayve malchus it says the word le'einecha, and by krisis it says le'einei. So therefore we learn one from the other, and you get malchus by chayve krisis. The Gemara asks them that if that's the case, you should learn chayve misas bezdin as well, because there also it says similar l'shainas, einei le'einei, it's mileinechon le'einei. The Gemara tries to answer that no, you can't learn such a gzeir shava because it's two different words. The Gemara rejects that for two reasons. We see, number one, that even where words are dissimilar, if the teichen is the same, we do learn gzeir shavas like the shava kain and moreover, even if you can't learn chayve krisis directly from chayve, even if you can't learn chayve misas bezin directly from chayve malchus, you could do it with two stages. The malchus can be learned to krisis with the above mentioned gzeir shava le'einei le'necha, and then you can learn misas bezin from kares because they have two similar words. So the Gemara Taka rejects the teretz of Ravo that there's a special limud by Kares to tell you that we don't say Kedei Rishasa as a Kedei Shab, which tells me that you get malchus as well as Kares. That can't be the issue, because if that was the case in such a Kedei Shava, then you would also have to learn Kedei Shava by Misas Bezin as well, and that would also be Chayev malchus. And we know Rabbi Shmuel doesn't hold that, Rabbi Kiva doesn't hold that. So what's Taka Pshan Rabbi Kiva? The Gemara Taka says Risha Masura LeBezdin. Kedei Rishasa only applies. The din that you can't get two punishments only when Bezin are both giving both punishments. Misa and Mama, and Malchus and Mama, and Misa and Malchus. But where it's Kares and another punishment, in this case Malchus. So then, since one of the punishments is from the Eibishter, so the Bezin can give the second one. That's not an issue of Kedei Rishasa. Basically, and at this stage, the Gemara Taka understands that even Rabbi Taisus points this out, but the Chorets Muchach from the Gemara, that even Rabbi Kiva, who says that we don't give you Misa and Malchus, is only when you taka getting Misa. If for whatever reason there was no Misa because the person wasn't warned, then if you taka agree, you get Malchus, because the whole reason why he's saying you don't is because of Kedei Rishasa. That's at this stage of the Gemara. The Gemara now says another teretz of Rava, which taka learns Makkos, which Rabbi Kiva totally different. And according to Rava, and Rava says this, Rabbi Shmuel, who says that you get Malchus for Misas Bezin, Rabbi Shmuel never meant to say you get Misa and Malchus. It's only that you get Malchus where there's no Misa. You weren't warned for the Misa. For whatever reason, you're not getting Misa, so then you get Malchus. If there was both Misa and Malchus, he would say Kedei Rishasa. He says Kedei Rishasa, and he doesn't hold this far Misa Richter like we said earlier. So that why Taka? And it's understood why you get Malchus, because there's no Misa. In other words, you get Malchus by a lav of Misas Bezin in a situation where there's no Misa for one reason or another. So then you get Malchus. And Rabbi Akiva is saying that even so you don't. What's Taka the Machlokes if that's the case? The Machlokes is whether Lav Shenitin Azar Mishas Bezdin Loikin Olav or Ein Loikin Olav. According to Rishmal, Lav Shenitin Azar Mishas Bezdin is Loikin Olav. I don't care the fact that the Torah is telling you don't be Mechal Shabbos, and if you do, you get Skila. It doesn't mean you can't get Malchus as well. And the Rabbi Kiva says no. Lav Shenitin Azar Mishas Bezdin. Since the Torah is saying don't be Mechal Shabbos or don't do this Chiv Misas Bezdin, if you do, you're going to get Misa. The Lav is coming to tell you don't do it. And if you do, you're going to get the punishment. What punishment? Misa. You can't get Malchus because Einon Shalem came as here. We can only use the Lav out for one punishment, which is Misas Bezdin. And even in a situation where there's no Misas Bezdin, you're not going to get Malchus because there's no Lav which is telling you don't do it. And if you do, you're going to get Malchus. It's don't do it. And if you do, you're going to get Misa. Lav Shenitin Azar Misas Bezdin ain't loikinala. The Gemara asks if that's the case. The Rabbi Kiva holds of this far that when the Torah says don't do something and there's another punishment, so you never get Malchus. So why do you get Malchus for Karis? For Chayve Krisis? Why does Rabbi Kiva hold you get Malchus for Chayve Krisis? Gemara basically says that Chayve Krisis loy tzrich hasra. This whole punishment of Einon Shalem came as here, and that the Torah has to tell you don't do something and only then you can get punished, is only for punishments be the order, but not for Chayve Krisis. Chayve Krisis don't necessarily bring a rai from Pesach Hamida that you get Karis even though there's no lav. There's no don't do it, don't. Doesn't say in the Torah don't stay uncircumcised. It says yes, do a bris. So from there we see clearly that the klal, like the Torah, needs to tell you don't do something, right? And only then you can get kares. There's no such thing, and therefore the kares doesn't need a lav. And when the Torah says a lav by chayve krisis, it's available to give. It can be used to get malchus. The Gemara asks, challenges that maybe that's hard for the carbon. Maybe the Torah is telling you don't do it because if you do it b'shoige, you're going to get a carbon, and therefore you can't get malchus. And the Gemara brings a raya. The Chor Pesach Hamila indicates this because Pesach Hamila, both cases where there's no carbon. Why was there no carbon? Because there's no lav. Sounds like you need a lav in order for there to be a carbon. And if that's the case, the lav of chayve krisis is in order that you should get carbon, but it's not available to tell me that you get malchus. So Gemara answers no. Your basic premise that the reason why Pesach Hamila doesn't get a carbon, is not chayiv carbon when you transgress them b'shoigeg is because there's no lav. Is not true. Rather, it's compared to avodas kichavim. Pasuk of carbon chatzis is said by avodas kichavim, just like over there. It's you're doing something actively, so not passive. So therefore, any situation where you're passively transgressing in avera, you don't get there's no carbon. But really, you don't taka neither as hard for the carbon, and therefore the lavin by chayve krisis are available to get malchus. So far, basically, in this Amud, we've explained the reasoning of Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva. Rabbi Kiva in two ways. First way was that they're arguing about Kedei Rishasai. Rabbi Shmuel holds that we don't say Kedei Rishasai by Misa and Malchus because Misa Richter. Rabbi Kiva say we do say Kedei Rishasai. And ultimately, why Kedei Rishasai? Because he holds that you only say so why not by Chayve Krisis? Because Rishon Mesor LeBezdin. He only applies it to Rishon Mesor LeBezdin, but not Chayve Krisis, which the Eibishter gives. And Rabbi has a whole different way of explaining the Machlokes Bishra Mekiv. It's not about Kedei Rishasai, and therefore everyone would agree that if you're getting Misa, you don't get Malchus as well. The whole Machlokes is Lav Shenitin Lazar's Mrs. Bezdin Loikin or Ein Loikin. How on Lav Shenitin Lazar's Kares is not an issue because you don't need a Lav for Kares. Kares Leisri Chasat doesn't need to tell me a Lav. Some other side points which we mentioned, and I will stop over here. And we'll see you all Bez Hashem next week for Daf Yud Dalet.